Injuries to Chris Godwin and Michael Thomas and a handful of other big name wide receivers might have fantasy managers scrambling a little bit in week 4. But fear not, SI fantasy analyst Michael Fabiano here to break down which passing game playmakers to start and sit. Fabs, let's start with the receivers to get into lineups this week.
I'm going to talk about Odell Beckham Jr. And I haven't talked about Odell Beckham Jr. in a start him and sit him column or video in a long, long time because he has been well obvious. But since the start of last year, he's 25th in fantasy points among wide receivers. He's had 2 stinkers in his first 3 games. So I feel like, you know what, Bill? I'm going to throw out some validation for fantasy fans. Keep the faith this week against the Cowboys, all right? He has averaged over 16 fantasy points per game against Dallas, and my beloved Dallas defense is not good. They have allowed the 3rd most fantasy points to receivers lined out wide. This is one of those weeks where you can actually have faith in Odell Beckham Jr., and that's been few and far between over the last year plus. So keep him in your lineups. And then Devonte Parker, who despite the fact that he's been banged up, is still pretty good. I mean, he's had 5 catches in back-to-back games, and he's had now 10 days to heal from his ailments because Dolphins played on Thursday night last week. I like the matchup against Seattle. It's very attractive. Their defense has allowed an average of over 11 catches, 179 yards, and a league-high 31.3 fantasy points per game to receivers who line out wide. That's where Parker runs 82% of his routes, and DK Sportbook has the over-under in this one at 54. Should be a high-scoring game. Start Devonte Parker.
All right, now for the wide receivers that you're suggesting people sit, you actually have a rookie and a longtime veteran. Who are they?
Yeah, Julian Edelman wasn't good last week. The week before, he was tremendous. But I feel like he is a wide receiver 3 flex at best, and it's a risk-reward scenario. Kansas City's defense has been really good against slot receivers. In fact, they've allowed the fewest catches, the fewest yards, and the fewest fantasy points to enemy slot receivers this season, all right? So while Edelman might be tough to sit, if you have depth, if you have a running back that you utilize as a flex starter over Edelman, I would consider doing that this week because the matchup is just not good. And then Justin Jefferson was probably the most added wide receiver in a lot of fantasy leagues, and I get it. 175 yards, 1 touchdown. He looked like it was at LSU last week. But the matchup this week is not great, all right? The Texans, they've been really tough on receivers lined out wide, allowing an average of just 66.3 yards and the 7th fewest fantasy points. And keep in mind, the Texans have had some really tough competition over their first 3 games, right? They've played Kansas City, they've played Baltimore, they've played Pittsburgh, and they've still been very tough on receivers lined out wide. So, while Jefferson should be on fantasy rosters, he should not be in your starting lineup. I fear you're chasing the fantasy points with the rookie this week.
Great insight as always. You can get Michael Fabiano's custom player rankings for week 4 by becoming a member of SI Fantasy Plus. It's only $14.99 a month. Go to si.com/fantasy for more info.